And yes, we do due diligence, and we believe there's a five elements for the success of the startup. That is, one is like the team, product, market, execution, and the capital. We always look for, there's a lot of competitors, like their agent also, or why the customer wants to buy it, what is the purpose, and so, that kind of thing that we got to evaluate. Yeah.
Thank you so much for attending our second panel today. I'm so happy to listening to investors' perspective because of AI agent, AI startup founder. We need money, right? So that's why we really need to get opinion, voice from investors' side. It's super important, right? Okay, so please introduce yourself. What do you do in Tokyo?
Hello everyone, my name is Erdinç. Most people know me from the Founder Institute. It's an accelerator program. It's the world's earliest stage-focused accelerator program and largest in that. But at the same time, we also have programs for the venture capitalists to launch funds as well, right? So we are in the both side of the table and the largest ecosystem builder in the world. And I'm representing and I brought the program from Silicon Valley to Japan, after that Korea and Taiwan. But that is actually my quarter-time commitment to contribute to development of the Japanese ecosystem. So I'm also an active founder. Most people don't know it actually. It's a completely bootstrap company, profitable and growing, but slow growth company. With just 10 employees. It's very small but pretty productive. It's called OpenFoco. It's a partnership development platform. Go check it out. And also lastly, I do advisory services to here and there. It's not like my full-time thing. To governments and corporates to develop ecosystems, partnerships, and so on. And they also we collaborate with them to be support startups as well. It's mostly scale-ups, but my heart actually is supporting the pre-seed as early as startups as possible. That's why they're on the Institute program. And also using them on the process of, that's why they give me this title, launching a VC that is focused on pre-seed focus and supporting pre-seed startups, GTM activities from Japan, Asia to Japan, Japan to global. So only going to be support your GTM activities if you work together. Yeah, so basically this. Thanks for having me.
So I think I explained about the global hands-on VC, so I don't need to explain any further.
But there are new guests.
Okay.
Please
All right.
introduce Ken-san.
Okay, sure. Global Hands-On VC is it's a Japanese VC fund that invests in the Japanese technology startup and help them going global. Founded by 2 Japanese and 3 Americans. And a little bit of myself. I originally started my career at a trading company, Show UI, and I was a telecom guy. And later on, I've been in the US and I was doing the corporate VC at that time, investing in the telecom company and help them go into the Japanese market. And we decided to spin out the operation. We did become independent VC in the US and raise around $100 million to invest in the US based startups. And then I came back to Japan after 9 years of the VC operation in Silicon Valley. I was still keep investing into the technology startup. I was also headhunted by the Japanese government fund. It's called INCJ, having like $21 billion under management. I was the managing director of the venture investment side. And I also have done the CFO of the Japanese semiconductor startup. It's embedded memory startups. And I was also used to be a director of the Japan Venture Capital Association. I was currently head of the global committee at the Japan Venture Capital Association. And I started this company like 4 years ago. So, and still the young fund. Okay, thank you.
Today's venue, thanks to Ken-san. Thank you so much.
I feel like I shouldn't sit here next to Ken-san, but I'm a venture capitalist working for Bonzi Investment Group, which is the Japanese fund focusing on investing the ESG themes company but we also invested into some like AI agent company called Turing, which is like creating the autonomous driving cars here in Japan. And a bit of myself, I used to work for Ryunosuke Ventures, which is a US fund as a senior fellow, and worked for the private equity fund in Germany, and came back to Japan just like a year ago or something. And I like to like more globalizing Japanese startup ecosystem. So I'm so happy to see so many international faces here, and excited to chat with you guys. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Great. So I have tons of questions, but so as a VC side, do you do due diligence? Due diligence. My pronunciation is okay. Recently, I learned new word, due diligence. So I didn't know that. Yeah, sorry, but the definition is okay. If I am a founder, so as a VC, you guys have to research, or Kaori, she doesn't have crime, or she has something good AI engineer background like that, right? So do you do? Tell us.
Yes. Yeah, for sure. But some universal due diligence criteria that I'm following, for sure. But still, it's pre-seed, so I have to believe it. And it's also there's a numbers game. When you back a company, even though they get a venture back, there's 50% chance of they're going to be rehabilitated or go to zero. So the definition is there. It's also case by case, actually. But we do, yes, sure.
Thank you.
And yes, we do due diligence, and this is a core of our functions probably. And we tend to ask we believe there's a 5 elements for the success of the startup. That is, one is like the team, product, market, execution, and the capital. So we have capital, and but we have to evaluate the ability of the team and formation of the team, and also the market size, and how do you see the competitive market and product definition. And we try to, especially I originally from the salesperson, the lazy salesperson always looking for some differentiators, and that differentiator has to be massive differentiator. We try to call it the unfair advantage, especially in a technology way. So we try to look for some unfair advantage on the product. We always look for, there's a lot of competitors, like the AI agent also. So how, just like, there's some discussion before why the customer wants to buy it, what is the purpose and applications, and what is the revenue size, what is the cross sale, and so that kind of thing that we got to evaluate. Yeah.
Yes, so we do, and for like AI agent or AI perspective, and considering about people here, that is, I think the question will be for the early stage AI startups, and for that instance, I think the team and story is probably the most critical part, because for instance, Turing. Turing is a company that's founded by Issei Yamamoto. He's like one of the most leading AI researcher of the country. So because of this, he can collect like enough talent from the researching community, and because like everyone wants to work with the top company, like I'm Sakana AI or like if it's in Japan. So like what kind of the attractiveness like the founders have is critically important, and what kind of vision it has. So we like to invest in the company that can bring the people to the moon or something. But also team is not only the vision story. So there's like as Yasuda mentioned, like the sales perspective. So in order to like go into the moon, we need to have NASA. And we need to have people that can create NASA as well. So it's not only the vision, but it's kind of like a balance is really important. For case of the Turing, there's a salesperson from like Melody joined, and since then like their valuation went up like radically. And that kind of perspective, we would like to care about it. Yeah.
Thank you. I wonder. Okay,
Hello?
I wonder even due diligence AI agent is happen. What do you think?
You don't need due diligence, just give us the money.
You are right. Okay, so next question. Okay, what do you think? So you guys come from Silicon Valley, actually, right? Everyone, right? So you knew like your ex-colleague or like team member, ex-team member from Silicon Valley, and you guys still have a connection. And then now you guys are in Tokyo. So what do you think? Like AI agent is kind of what can I say, super popular. Do you think kind of like difference, like from your observation in this year in Tokyo and Silicon Valley, there are many kind of similar product or similar companies, almost the same. Maybe it's happened, and maybe their use case is kind of similar. But as an investor's perspective, I don't know, Japan has maybe more unique, or I don't know. Tell us about your observation.
I see. So as far as I understand the question, so you're asking like this is what is the core differentiation between the Silicon Valley ecosystem versus Japan?
Yeah, as
AI agent perspective. Okay. So I mean, to be honest, Japan is adopting the technologies and the recent trends pretty late than average other countries. That's the elephant in the room. But it doesn't mean it's bad. It's just a natural thing, right? So in terms of ecosystem, so it's actually a pretty hot ecosystem, especially in AI, and especially and most of the application of the, especially the robotics or the hardware. There's a lot of interest going on in Japan. I'm kind of like optimistic around that. But of course, comparing Silicon Valley versus Tokyo it's actually hard. Or maybe I can give one example. So to our program, so I've been running this program here in Japan like the last 3 years. The AI startups or the startups that identify themselves AI, you can identify anything, right? So, anyways, was like 10% of the startups who is applying and getting the program. But now the second year was like 50%. Now everybody, literally everybody, like any startup that is doing, for example, workspace automation, like it's AI, or some sort of robotics, the healthcare, biotechnology. It's like, maybe it has to be this way, the natural process of it. So maybe this case study might give us some ideas on how it's getting hot here, but it's taking time, So it's been just 3 years, right? So, yeah.
By the way, the VC is kind of job will be taken by AI agent. So we are in the threat. Anyway, well, actually, there's a lots of human aspect in the people's management. So I think the VC is the kind of job that, our charter is not to select the company. We help them grow. And the growing the business also means how to manage or how to maneuver within the people's communications. So, but that's it aside, going back to your original questions. So there's a lot of similarity or some metaphor with the SaaS model. In the US SaaS model, Japan came late, and there's a lot of uniqueness in the Japanese SaaS model because the business process is different. So that's why smart HR of the world, the money tree, so on, free, they survive and they become go public. But I don't think that will happen in the AI agent world because I think there's a still a difference in the business process, but AI agent can take over. You can be agnostic with the language. You can be agnostic with some of the business process. So you don't have to. The uniqueness of each vertical become less important because as compared to the SaaS model or AI agent model. However, there's some certain vertical. I mean, in my opinion, AI agent, you really need to have some good data to avoid the hallucination or to make the better decision for your customer. So, like for example, some certain industry vertical, like automobile, robot, or some chemical, or some silicon substrate, or you name it. So that way, you will be shining. And by going after some certain Japanese customer, and you refine your AI agent model. So I think that's yes, there's still the good opportunity in the Japanese role, but it will be a different migration, SaaS migration. SaaS migration model will be different from the AI migration model.
The difference is, well, like there are like several differences I found regarding like observing the Japanese AI like startup AI agent startups versus the Silicon Valley. I feel like the Japanese it's probably wrong, but the Japanese AI agent startup tend to focus on really niche market, and tend to be like. The only advantage they tend to have is that the language barriers. And not all companies, but many that I found that calling themselves as like AI agent or AI companies. And I think that's critical issues is that like it's kind of like automating the part of workflow, and if it's like too small, and then only in Japanese market that become problem. But at the same time, there are like a bunch of the international founders in Japan, like Kimaru AI or like from like Alchemist teams, and like I found that they tend to have more like their like Silicon Valley, like similar like global mindset. And so like I like to like emphasize like more of the international like founders here, and like the support, and like make it big from Japan, because the Japanese, like the corporate environment, for instance, I work in the States and work in Europe and now in Japan, and one thing I noticed that we don't have a virtual assistant. That's normal things to have in the global companies. But we ask the Japanese worker to work till like in the middle of the night, and they are not really like, as you said, they don't love the job at all, and so, which means that AI agent company in Japan has like huge potential of market, while like in the States they already have the existing solution that's cheap and good enough already. So like the motivation of the customer might be higher here, and that's the big advantage that Japanese ecosystem may have.
Thank you so much. Okay, it's just like 8 p.m. So let's do Q&A. So, okay, you are so fast.
Thank you for the talk. My name is Francisco, and I really liked the last question, the last points. And I think one of the things that I saw a lot here in Japan, I mean, I've been here for almost 20 years now, and I think the language barrier was a thing that was mentioned here. I think it happens a lot. You see something in the US, you bring it here, you do it in Japanese. Because you can do it in Japanese, you already take the market just because the international company cannot do things in Japanese. I think that happened a lot. Also in the SaaS space, as you mentioned, I don't think it's gonna cut it anymore for companies to just do something in Japanese. Because I just saw a company the other day in the US. They just used AI video company, HeyGen, to just generate, they just translated all their YouTube videos into Japanese. And it was 80% okay. it was not perfect Japanese, but 80% is really good. So I think, this is what's going to happen. I think it's going to be iPhone all over again. From your perspective as a VC, how do you see the mindset changing or not changing? What's the risk for Japanese founded startups not really looking at the outside? Are they changing their mindset, trying to go abroad? Because I think if they don't go abroad, the market is just going to be taken over by everything coming from the outside. What's your view on that?
I mean, I completely agree. There's a language barrier become less important, and I see more younger generation, the guy with the 20 or 30s, will speak better English as compared to the guys with the 50 or 60. So I think Japanese language is not going to be the winning factor. So there's a lot of Japanese entrepreneur, and they still try to. That is one blame to the venture capitalist. Venture capitalist the Japanese venture capitalist tends to look for some revenue. Quick revenue, and become profitable as soon as it can. But that is the ingredients to create some living debt, like profitable company, but it's not growing. So I think there's a little bit mindset change in the Japanese VC side. So that started to happen. And there's a lot of Japanese entrepreneur who wants to go global. For example, there's a survey, actually it's a survey done by the Venture Economic Center, VEC, and according to them, like 30% of the startup that they have interviewed, they have some of the ground in the international market, whether it is US or Taiwan or Thailand or whatever. And 57% of the survey wants to go abroad within 3 years. So there's a lot of guys who believes you cannot stay here and go into some growth market, IPO in Japan, that doesn't make you happy. So I think there's a more demand. However, still they are coming from the product out model. They created something and they were trying to find a way to sell that product. Japan is not a good place, so they want to go global, go into the US market, but that doesn't make sense. There's too many competitors. So I think there should be some mindset change for the Japanese entrepreneurs. They have to think about what the market demand. So I think one of the reasons why 3 out of 5 company we invested is a CEO is a foreign person. International people have that kind of mindset. They are going for the market-in approach. So that's why I like the international management team. So I think, and also a Japanese person, domestic Japanese person is also receptive to having some international team. Even their English skill is like 80% or 60%, but some young guys is not afraid of having the team. So I think I'm very bright. Hopeful, and looking for the bright future. Especially like you guys. You guys are coming here and work here, and it's a good place to live. It's a good food and safe. And the Japanese people is really open up a kimono, willing to work with you guys. So I think I like to encourage everybody to go and look for startup and work together with the Japanese, and they are open. So that is kind of active approach. You want to change the Japanese culture, you can be the part of that. So I think I like to encourage everybody to work and try to change this country.
How many Japanese founders are there here? Japanese founders. Japanese founders don't go abroad. Abroad is coming to you. How many non-Japanese founders are here?
And try to get if you're a Japanese founder, try to get some international kind of employees or like someone who has experience in international market, because they're like now you can see in the Japanese VC scene that there are international kind of funds existing that are willing to invest in the companies to go abroad, and obviously also the other side, that the Japanese traditional funds that really don't want to go, like portfolio company to go abroad as well. So like just choose the right side, and like act wisely, and you can have like gigantic, how to say, the money here. Like we have cash. Like Japan is rich in cash.
Show me the money.
I mean, not me, but that's the reason why many foreign funds come here for getting money. And like,
I'm here for food.
yeah. But anyway,
No, great point. If there are Japanese founders want to know how to succeed outside, talk to this guy. Okay, Glass, right? They raise your hand. So they raised a bunch of money in San Francisco, and very Japanese founders, doing pretty well. So check them out. One last question, maybe, right? One last question. Oh, Joshua. Joshua has a pretty cool startup. I would invest just right now.
Yeah, thank you very much for the talk and really interesting perspectives from you guys. I have a question for companies founded in Japan, and like, what advice do you give to such kind of companies that are kind of forward-looking in terms of, you know, I've heard a lot of comments about Japan being kind of late in some, you know, adopting some technologies and things like that. So what kind of advice do you give those kind of companies who are working in this area and they're trying to change some kind of the late ways that Japan is trying to, the way that Japan is kind of late, for example, maybe in healthcare and in all the areas, and what kind of ideas or what kind of advice you give them in order to stay viable in Japan and also be able to like approach global audience.
Coming to your point, I just also would like to add a couple comments here. So, and by the way, thank you so much for Global Hands-on VC. Yasunaka-san. So, you guys are really forward thinking. You know, we would like to see more support to development of the Japanese ecosystem, especially international ecosystem. So, I think one of the biggest problem there, just like Francisco said, is language. We were having some internal discussion with the global team that what if we just we could just create an English course, so but for free and compete against some other English courses. So so we can attract more Japanese people. Give like 3 to 6 months practical English knowledge, so they can be ready. They should be an entrepreneur, right? And then accept the programs perhaps. So, and it could be free. But of course, how is whatever is going to work, and the economy is going to work. So it's that much big problem here. So and then investing or partnering with a startup founder who is not capable to communicate in a global language is just big red flag actually. And it should be. Can you imagine bringing in an important meeting overseas and then just screw it? And a representative of the company cannot communicate the real values of the company, cannot even explain what is the business all about, right? How it is going to be defending a dangerous condition, for example, globally. So it's actually like we need to improve this, and I'm happy to have that kind of initiation and initiatives. And also, pre-seed is extremely important in our case. So why is pre-seed is all about groundwork, making the ecosystem ready, ecosystem work more than the actually working with the startups. Then seeding, help them seed these groundwork so they can flourish. So follow-up VCs or later stage VCs can invest to them, right? So we need to create more advocacy and awareness and the advocacy around the entrepreneurship. And as we can also connect to the AI related agents to this. People can create more companies, and then they can more invest, and capital can be more attracted here. We are at this stage, so we need more inflow of the supply of startups more than the capital. Capital is here. I completely agree with you. Capital is here, but people just don't know how to invest in emerging markets because it's an intelligent capital. It's not just like the commodity that you buy or public market you buy. I mean, public market is also sophisticated. Anyways, so coming to your point that a couple of advice could be that, so this current AI age, right? The cost of starting a startup or building a product is rapidly decreasing. I'm not including the fundamental models, the development of these kind of things, or things that require a lot of hardware. I'm not including this, or the deep tech startups. I'm not including these. But developing an application layer or practical use cases is getting easier. And then the programs like this is coming here. But we come by ourselves. Nobody brought to us here. I bring this one with my own network, my own capabilities. I use my resources to bring here. So a lot of opportunities for, especially foreigners here, because we come here, right? We try to attract the capital and the partnerships and so on here. A lot of potentials here. We just actually can look at the existing SaaS market, especially the SaaS, like it's related with the topic. You know, the 40% of the entire unicorns created in Silicon Valley is SaaS companies, actually, last 20 years. If you look at them, so there are many problematic areas or late to adopt the current the technological advancements of the Gen AI. So you can actually develop something on it, right? Source is here, capital also coming here. There are a lot of VCs that are attracting and wants to make some deals here, but they don't know what to do, how to do. Just they don't know how to get into the market, right? So I think I'm pretty optimistic. I'm pessimistic, optimistic, though. So there are many things that we can actually collaborate on this. So you can check it out. We produce a lot of free contents. We have new program upcoming, and so on. Yeah. Thank you so much for.
Yeah. I mean, if I may add to the advice, there's a character of the Japanese corporates, and there's also a character of the international corporates. And we talk about some money. There's a lot of money sitting in the corporate's bank account. They have like trillions of dollars, and they're doing nothing. And that's why one of the reasons that many of the corporates started their corporate VC program. Their charter is to invest in the fancy startup, but also but at the same time, they do some POCs. So why don't we take advantage of that? They were willing to have some new POC. And then, okay, if you stay in here, there's some definition called POC jigoku, which means keep doing the POC, but doesn't lead to the actual revenue. But if you target it to the global market, so okay, you have some POC from Toyota, and then go to Hyundai, or BYD, or BMW of the world. Okay, we have a POC of Toyota. You solve this this problem, and you can replicate that. You can create some program. I mean, actual product. If you're gonna stay on Japan and keep make them happy, you end up with just a consulting company, and your product is not global anymore. So you want to take advantage of quick bite from Japanese corporate and take advantage of that and going after some huge fish. So I think I think it's a little bit general, but that's one of the advice. You have to aim global, but Japan is a unique market. They're very detail oriented, and they are very reliability is very key. So I invested in some of the company who really test the product in here, install it at NTT or KDDI, and they hammer out, and your quality, your reliability goes like 7-digit, 99.9999%. So I think that's really makes it easy to sell that in the international market.
Yes, that's really, I think, true. For instance, many of I as advices, I give some advices to Europeans and American company startups time to time, and they try to seek get the like approval from a Japanese company because the quality is like no. And also for founders, I would say the early stage investment, so like seed, pre-A, Japan is fairly easier to get money than US. So like take the advantage of early stage kind of benefit you can get here, like POC, money, and like support, and then go to global, like from like Series A or B, so that you can like produce the global product and have like more stronger cap table and yeah. So.
Can I ask a question?
Time, right?
Time.
Very quick one, just both. How many people are founders? How
Wow.
many people wants to become a founders, aspiring to become a founder? How many people supports the startups here, like venture capital, mentor, etc. Right? And the last one, just really curious. How many people use AI agent? All right, the definition is like now very blurry, right? It's actually the adoption of the AI agents is pretty low actually, because it's pretty new, right? Actually. Anyways, I just was like curious.
Okay, I think we are done here. There is a pizza that's not AI but real, and there are drinks somewhere there. We don't have alcoholic drinks because well, you need to be sober to discuss these topics. Right, so please enjoy some food. There's some place somewhere. Keep this room tidy, and then around 9 we'll start kicking everybody out and setting everything in place. Thanks again, Mr. Naga-san, for hosting us here. Thanks for the speakers.